Thanks, Chuck. So we've talked a lot today about this journey to microservices, and a lot of times you can think of this as sort of the ideal world we're all trying to get to. The truth is, we all know in this room there are a lot of pitfalls you might experience on the way there, and so we're going to talk today a little bit about how to set your teams up for success. So joining me are 4 people who know this journey well and can talk to that. So first up is Karishma Irani, Principal PM at Launch Darkly.
Hi.
We also have Ryan Michela, Principal Engineer at Salesforce. Tammy Butow, Principal SRE at Gremlin. And Selina Liu, Software Engineer at Airbnb. Thanks for joining me, everybody.
Yeah.
So maybe to start, we can start with how, what was the catalyst to start taking this journey in the first place? Karishma, I know you mentioned the idea of a free puppy and how that ties into the idea of monoliths, and maybe you can explain that a little bit.
Yeah, I was kind of hoping you'd forgotten that. I work at Launch Darkly, and for those of you, the name just rolls right off the tongue, Launch Darkly. So for those of you who may not know what Launch Darkly does, it's a feature management platform that allows dev and operation teams and PM and PMM teams feature flag things so you can test in production. Launch Darkly had already adopted microservices well before I started there. But over the years, as I've met with customers and basically wondered what it is that makes them want to transition to microservices, I hear all kinds of crazy reasons. The first one is, well, my manager just asked us to. The second one is, it's caused by an acquisition. And the third one is, well, everyone's doing it, so we should do it. None of these are good catalysts to transition to microservices. So Launch Darkly's primary reason is just the growth of the company, how fast the product is growing, how quickly we want to deliver to customers. And we definitely do have a monolith also for our core platform, but every new thing that we build on top of that is built as a microservice first. So, yeah.
Cool. Ryan, maybe you want to speak to that as well?
Sure. I work at Salesforce, and we are an old company as far as the internet's concerned. We go back like 20 years. And over those 20 years, we started and have continued to build this enormous monolith. It's staggeringly huge. Thousands of engineers work on it every day. And that just doesn't scale for us anymore. Thousands of engineers in one code base, all interacting and all integrating with each other continuously. We needed microservices, and we've been working towards them. So, yeah, organizational flexibility is definitely one of our big motivators.
And I'm Tammy Butow, work at Gremlin, and we have a chaos engineering product, so we do chaos engineering as a service. And one of the reasons I think microservices are useful and valuable is because, if I'm an SRE, so obviously I want to improve reliability, durability, make sure you never lose data, make sure you have very good uptime and have less outages. It's much better if I can say to somebody, hey, what are our top 5 critical services? And if we can then say, let's focus on fixing those first and making sure those are really good, that's a very, very good way to get results. And I used to work at Dropbox where we were doing the migration to microservices as well. Because of that reason, it helps you just create a better product for your customers that's more reliable and more durable. So,
sure.
Yeah.
Hi everyone, I'm Selina from Airbnb. So very similar to Salesforce, Dropbox, and other stories shared here. We were just growing so much. Our monolithic application was built on Ruby on Rails, and that was very handy initially when we were trying to push out features, I guess create new flows for hosts to book, for guests to book listings, for hosts to manage their listings. But down the road, our team grew pretty quickly, and our ways of working also evolved. So shifting to, I guess, SOA or service-oriented architecture kind of helped us rethink the ways that we collaborate, and also help us to, like spin up new business verticals, and also think about, I guess, scaling our technical infrastructure for the long term.
Well, yeah, all that makes sense. And I think one thing that we've talked about in the past as a group here is, as you decide to take this first step into microservices, regardless of what group of services you're tackling, there's sort of a benefit to having some operational maturity or some agreements among teams so that you can scale that up. Tammy, I think you'd mentioned the idea of making sure there's some automation in place or maintainership agreements.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, I think that's a very useful thing when you're moving to that services architecture. To be able to know who owns what service is really handy, who maintains it, how do I change code in that service for that service. One of the things that we did at Dropbox was we actually had my team that I was leading at the time, one of the teams, I led storage, databases, and code workflows. And the code workflows team created a really easy to use file, like a YAML file, for anybody to be able to say, this is the service and this is who owns it, this is who you need to contact. And I think that's also really important because then you can figure out how you can improve it if you identify issues. And then when I went to Gremlin, I was like, actually, this is pretty cool too, because you can do chaos engineering on a service to test that everything works. Like, say, for example, your automation for your service. You can break something on purpose, check that everything works out. If it doesn't, you can then use your ownership file to be able to contact the owner. Super important at a massive company, where you've got, say, 800 engineers, maybe a few hundred services. I think, like, Uber itself has hundreds of services, over 300 or something. And some teams might have actually more than 3 services per team. So yeah, that becomes very important.
Yeah, and speaking of at-large companies and the proliferation of services, Selina, I know you'd mentioned you guys have an interesting process at Airbnb for sort of review.
Right, so in my org, so I'm on the homes team. In my org, we have I guess a very formalized review process where we have 2 or 3 tech leads from different subgroups. They would actually come in and, I guess, discuss with you on like the purpose of your service, the scalability of your service. And I think the goal is to socialize the idea that you are trying to build with like the broader team, and to kind of, I guess, like fan out and to see if there's any other team that's like considering the same, I guess, trying to solve the same problem as you and considering the same solution, and if there's any opportunity for you to maybe, I guess, build a more reusable solution for other teams to use. So I think that's really important to, I guess, avoid the pitfall of like, building a microservice for like every single little thing, because at the end of the day, that's like a lot of operational overhead as well. I think we are trying very hard to really consider the boundaries between services, because if you get that wrong, it's really, really hard for you to like refactor across different services, as compared to when you were just like in a monolithic application, you're just like, working with modules that have like softer boundaries. So I think having a more formal review process was like really helpful for, just like maintaining the health and, trimming the ecosystem to something that's leaner.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because you want to avoid the grand refactor, but I think we also had a panelist earlier today talking about how they're constantly refactoring. How about you two? Any thoughts on how you handle sort of reviews among teams before you get too far down the line?
Sorry.
Sure. Yeah, I think you mentioned that, Ryan, you've got sort of a guild approach at Salesforce that you guys take.
Sure. We have virtual architecture teams, which are purely advisory in nature. It's an opportunity if someone's a team is building a service and they want to talk about databases or RESTful APIs or something, they can submit a plan for review. And then senior engineers around the company can all comment, and it provides a venue for kind of vetting some of these designs and getting a lot of organizational feedback on it. Importantly, though, it's not a gate, because part of the value of microservices is that teams are able to independently iterate and deploy and build, and you don't want to take all of this parallel iteration and shove it through a single gate where one team has to put a stamp on every single architectural decision.
So what kind of challenges do you guys see that are specific to microservices? You know, what changes as you move from a monolith to microservice that you might not have prepared for, or you might not have thought of? Anyone can feel free to take that one.
Yeah, I can speak to that. So there's the obvious challenges that I'm sure everyone's run into, but I want to point out two very specific, unique challenges that I've seen repeatedly in customers of all size and all kinds of industries. The first one is communication. So it's not a coincidence that microservices, the era of microservices sort of coincided with the whole concept of DevOps. It's because we need to revisit our communication, we need to revisit how we address issues, how we go about solving them, and how what are our processes? So what's our communication? And the second thing I like to highlight is when you move to microservices, they're basically complex chains, and there's no standardization. So it's hard to test. People can only guess, hey, I tested it in my machine, it should work in production. That's not a great statement, and personally, as a product manager, it frightens me when I hear that. So I think the second point would be testing in production. So having an action plan that allows you to test things in production and make sure that in addition to revisiting your communication, you have a strategy to make sure that not only is your existing system functioning the way you intended for it to, but everything new you've built works in production at production scale.
Yeah, I think about the critical importance of automation. So you were mentioning DevOps and the need for that with microservices. With a monolithic application and a small dev team, you can get away with, build, test, release, compile, zip, package, and then, manually put it onto a machine. When you get to a microservices architecture, that just doesn't scale. You're building, you're testing, you're automating. Like all of that stuff has to be automated and locked down, or your organization is just going to fall over itself in human operational problems. So DevOps becomes super critical. All of the continuous automation, continuous deploy, all those kinds of ops things you hear about, you really do need to have those solidly in place before you try to go to microservices, or you're just going to trip over yourself during the transition.
So I think one of the big things that changes is incident management, and specifically on-call, and I think in a lot of really great ways too. So if you use microservices instead of a monolith, then you can make sure that you set up all of your on-call schedules correctly, that you're paging the right team. You can also do some really cool work with on-call training. Something that I like to do that I've been doing for the last few years at Gremlin and Dropbox is on-call training by injecting failure, doing chaos engineering. So you can actually start with a really small blast radius. Because of microservices, you can say, we're going to inject some latency or some packet loss into specifically the payment service. And then we're going to make sure that the right person knows how to handle it, the right person gets paged. If it falls through to the secondary, then they actually get paged in the right amount of time. You can make sure that your services have graceful degradation. And that's super hard to do when you have a monolith. So I think it's one of the biggest benefits of microservices.
I would agree that I think in a monolith, you don't achieve graceful degradation as easily.
Yeah, it's hard.
It's a single point of failure, but at the same time, I feel like in a microservices world, you have many points of failure. So I think the challenge would be for services to be resilient and to be robust enough to handle failures downstream, and then that a lot of times means defining, or identifying soft dependencies versus hard dependencies, and defining, the default behavior if any downstream service were to fail. So I think that that burden falls on the part of the product engineers building or running the service to be active in doing that. And I think another thing is also just defining the contracts between different services. I think it's not as easy to iterate on your module when it's a service that's running in production as compared to when you were just working on a library within a monolith. I think evolving the interface of your service is a more careful process in this, in a microservices world. I think early on in our migration, it was easier because we have enough business domain knowledge to know what changes fast and what does not, what stays the same most of the time. So in that way, when we were migrating out, like tearing things out, we had a good intuition of like what things should be grouped in the same service. But I think going forward with like new products, new features, we don't know how rapidly things could change. So I think that's something that like product engineers have to think more about when they are trying to build a new service or try to evolve their service to meet upstream clients' needs. Yeah.
You brought up a great point about resiliency. In a monolithic application, a method call either works or it doesn't work. When you start working with microservices, a method call could be across the wire, where it might work, but take 300 milliseconds or 30,000 milliseconds, or it might spin for eternity. It might partially fail. It might return bogus answers. There's all sorts of crazy things that can happen. So thinking about resiliency in microservices is a whole new domain of thinking for a lot of developers, but it's also critically important to deal with those kind of like partial failures. Something to think about.
It's interesting. I think it segues nicely into, if you think about, kind of two parts of this journey, you have a lot of different teams now, especially at large organizations. They're sort of choosing their own version of the best tool for the job. And so that means that you've got organizational communication challenges, but you've also got, if you look at like the CNCF logo chart, any number of things that you might choose. How do you guys decide, what's a trend versus what's a fad? How do you decide what to bet on?
My favorite thing to do is battle testing. So I like to try new technology. It's actually one of the values that we have at Gremlin. Like for example, our agent is written in Rust. But yeah, what we like to do is actually like take different technologies, put them alongside each other, and actually see which one comes out on top. I think that's a great thing to do. I think you should always make time because, if I used to work at a bank, and I used to work on mainframe stuff too. So, I know what it's like to be stuck in the past, and it's much better to encourage everyone around you to think about how can we do better, because that's a way to compete as well and keep your customers. If you have a faster system that you build that serves your customers, that's much more reliable. That works really well, especially if you're in the e-commerce world, or if you're in banking as well. If your internet banking service works better than your competitor, then people will switch to you. So yeah, it's interesting.
I think I guess the nice thing about SOA is that different teams owning different services can choose whatever, I guess, language or tech stack they want to use. There's technical heterogeneity in that sense, but I guess for infrastructure team that serve other engineering teams, the story is slightly different. I think the process will be more deliberate and more careful in terms of choosing new technology to adopt that would I guess impact other product teams. I think historically we have adopted. It's mostly case by case basis where we look at different technologies and do a very careful evaluation of the pros and cons and how they fit into our existing tech stack. And I really agree with battle testing. I think it's a lot about prototyping and doing a proof of concept before rolling it out to the masses. A lot of times when someone's really passionate about a new technology, a new solution, you could add a flag. They could give engineers the option to opt in, but the default would still be falling back to existing technology. So I think by socializing your new technology or the thing that you are championing for, I think that's how you get buy-in. It's all a very democratic process. Yeah. To summarize. Yeah.
Team autonomy is one of the big selling points of a microservices architecture. Teams get to make their own engineering decisions, and that works really well on the small. But when you start dealing with some of these cross-cutting concerns, if each team chooses a different feature flagging service, and some of them use LaunchDarkly, and some of them use other random things. Someone else uses a random library they found on the internet, and another team builds their own. It doesn't work when you have 9 different solutions to the same general problem, and that's an opportunity to step back, find those general problems, and then solve them with like a platform engineering team.
Yeah.
At LaunchDarkly, which we're a little shy of 150 employees, so definitely not at the Salesforce scale, not quite. But at LaunchDarkly specifically, we've taken a very conservative approach with our core platform being on tried and tested tools and technologies. But we absolutely try new things all the time, and sometimes we look at other companies that are moving at the same pace as us, growing at the same scale, and then we reach out to them and ask them what they're using, including customers, sometimes Gremlin. So we ask them, hey, what do you use? And we get ideas from there. Having said that, I think in the 6 months I've been there, we've absolutely tried, tested, and decided not to move ahead with several tools and technologies. That happens too.
Yeah, it's an interesting point too on sort of the community aspect of this whole journey across different companies, and we see open source projects that have these huge companies helping to maintain them as well. You guys have any sort of advice for the group on how to form those sort of partnerships at other companies outside of your own?
Start contributing to open source software. You'll find all sorts of amazing people out there, and since open source is a big communal effort, you'll meet great people from other companies who are all trying to solve the same problem, and start to build those channels.
Yeah, I think it's you can go to like say the Linux Foundation's events. Those are really great too. They have a lot of really interesting things and lots of good mailing lists that you can join. I've been involved in working with them. Like I find like all of the communities out there, you can just email them and ask for what you're interested in. Usually you'll always get a response back. That's what I've found for sure. Yeah, if anyone needs help, let me know.
Yeah, personally, I attend meetups just to like meet other engineers. I think it's very easy to, especially when you work for a big organization, to get siloed into like your own tech stack and not know what's out there. I think like going to meetups and like events like these are really helpful for like just like getting yourself exposed to the wider community, and also I guess getting different points of view from other people.
Yeah, and for us, we try to create a lot of these events and avenues internally. So one of the ways is we have this concept called a weird talk, where you can pick any topic and share it with the entire company. You can give a talk and people can volunteer to come in. This ranges from how to make yeast for beer to here's a new tool I tried out. And we also have what we call focus weeks once a quarter, where it's kind of like a vacation, but I like to imagine better for the team, because that's the week where all the things that you want to get to or have been at the back of your mind, or all the tech that's been on your mind, you can kind of go out, explore new tools, run POCs, fix anything you want. And the output from those events typically is, hey, I tried these 3 new tools out. I really like this. Does anyone else want to try this out with me? So, yeah.
That's very cool. Cool. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. Really appreciate it. To the panel, maybe one more round of applause for our panel here.